Global protests against institutionalised racism are continuing more than a week after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis police custody. These are live shots we're bringing you from the streets of Washington, D.C., one of the 40 cities which has imposed a curfew, which is now in place there. Demonstrations have been continuing from Alabama to New York, and the so-called Blackout Tuesday has filled social media. President Donald Trump has vowed to deploy the military if unrest continues. Our North America correspondent David Lipson joins us now from Washington. David, we spoke to you, about an hour ago? What's going on there now?
Well, hi again, Roz. The crowd here has just thinned out substantially. A huge crowd, thousands of people have just marched off in that direction, the direction of Congress. I spoke to a few people as they were walking away. They said they didn't exactly know where they were going, but they made clear that they were not going home. So we're now an hour into the curfew and no sign of anyone leaving at this point. Everything has been very peaceful. It's a very different crowd to yesterday, and perhaps the best indicator of that, chalk on the ground. Black Lives Matter written with chalk on the ground rather than spray painted on buildings and the like. But things do change quickly, as we've seen over the past week. But another indication that perhaps we are in for a long night. These stockpiles of water, milk that can be used to wash out eyes if people have been tear gassed, even ration packs and the like. So there are those little stockpiles all over the place. And from the people we've spoken to, no intention, as I say, of going home at this point.
So people do seem to be settling in. As you say, the curfew has been and gone. What's the police presence like there?
It's huge. It's huge, and it was absolutely immense last night. There were not just police officers, but military. There were National Guard. There was even the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. All sorts of agencies were mobilised to offer support, and we're told that there's even more out on the streets of DC tonight. So a very, very strong security presence. There are helicopters flying overhead. And as we've mentioned a few times, that big black fence now around Lafayette Park, which is adjacent to the White House, to keep people away from the lawns there.
So the White House is the main focus for protests there in Washington, D.C., is it, David?
It's the main focus, but there have been protests all over Washington, D.C., from the Lincoln Memorial, of course, which is a memorial to the father, if you like, of this grand and historic nation, all the way up to Congress. Even in the suburban streets, there have been sit-downs in what would normally be busy intersections, and in the suburbs too, up in Bethesda, about 4 or 5 kilometres away, there was a big march too. So this is a very big movement, or multiples of large movements that seem to have been activated. It's not quite yet clear exactly what has done that. But it seems that certainly in this city there is a very strong anti-Donald Trump message. This is traditionally a very much a Democrat city, so perhaps that's not surprising. The question is whether the protests that we're seeing in other states, other cities, that seem to have sprung up just in the last 24 hours or so and seem to really be made up of middle-class Americans, old, young, people who vote by the looks of things, whether they are people that would have voted against Donald Trump anyway, or whether the actions and the happenings of the past week and perhaps even the past few months relating to coronavirus have changed people's minds. It's too early to tell, but there are some early indications that certainly lawmakers, members of Congress, a couple of them have spoken out against Donald Trump, and that's pretty unusual in these times where he kind of rules over his Republican Party with a bit of an iron fist, if you like.
David, we learned a little bit more about George Floyd, whose death, the unarmed black man whose death sparked these US protests. We learned a little bit more about him, a couple of hours ago when his family made impassioned speeches.
Yeah, a really emotional plea from the mother of his child, and a very heart-wrenching statement as well, with his child there hiding behind the podium, hiding behind her mother. And really just stressing that message about George Floyd, who he was, that he was, according to his family, a very gentle man, community-minded, and someone whose death is just a huge loss to the community, and particularly those close to him. Of course, his name has now become synonymous with an entire movement, just like the name Rodney King did, but perhaps here even more strongly. We just spoke to a young mother who had her little daughter on her shoulders, and she said that she is here because she believes it's an historic moment. She has hope. She feels that this is the point that America will change, and if it doesn't, they will stay out on the streets until it does. So, there's been such an outpouring of rage over the past week. Certainly at this point, after the last 12 hours or so, it seems there's been a shift that people now want action. In some of the protests that we've seen, there's been a real push for people to get out and vote, not just at a federal level, at a presidential level, but also at state levels, at local levels, at all levels to vote and to make their voices heard, to change the policies, to shape the policies of entrenched racism in this country.
Have there been elections held both in Washington, D.C. and in other states today that were put off because of coronavirus, and what impact have the protests had on those?
There was an election locally here in DC, which did go ahead. I saw a few people walking around with stickers that said I voted. I'm not sure, to be honest with you, of the impact of the protests and coronavirus on those elections, whether turnout was affected, either positively or negatively. But they have been preparing for this election for quite some time, trying to make it as socially distanced as possible. And in regards to other elections that are going on around the country, and particularly leading up to the presidential election in November, there is a huge debate about the safety of elections and whether mail-in voting, which some Republicans feel would favour Democrats and as such are opposed to it, whether that would impact on the outcome in November as well.
David, we'll come back to you very soon, but for now, David Lipson reporting from the streets of Washington, D.C. Thank you. There's growing tension on the streets of New York City, where peaceful demonstrations have devolved into some of the most shocking rioting and looting overnight. New York-based Australian journalist Rachel Olding is there.
It seems to have escalated every night. I've been out since Friday night, and it started as really powerful and peaceful protests, and each night the ugly part of this issue seems to be getting bigger and bigger. And I will say that I think that three quite clear elements have emerged to me while covering this. There are the protesters who are coming out in bigger numbers every day, and are, as I've said, completely peaceful and have a really powerful message to share. But then each night there's been an element of anarchists, quite clearly, who have at some point just turned to destroying property, setting police vans on fire, smashing windows to stores, targeting big stores at Apple stores, Microsoft stores, all these big brands. And then the third element, which is just getting worse each night, is the looters. And they do seem to come into the city just to take advantage of the chaos and the protests, and to use that as a cover to just smash up an extraordinary amount of stores. I just saw people last night. It seemed to me to be quite an organised criminal effort. I saw groups of young people coming into the city in BMWs and Mercedes, parking, getting out, smashing the windows into, say, a video game store or a clothing store, load up garbage bags, and then jump back into the car and speed off to the next store.
Demonstrations across the US are playing out against the backdrop of a presidential election campaign. And as the country approaches the November election, a former chair of the Republican National Committee says he's concerned President Trump's handling of the crisis will inflame civil unrest.
It is something to keep your eye on. The president, coming off of and still having to deal with COVID-19, the economic fallout from that, which has been massive, over 30, almost 40 million Americans unemployed. And now these racial and social tensions arising. My concern is that this election turns into a very dark, ugly spot out of desperation to hold on to political power. And that's something that I don't know if the country can withstand. And so my hope and my prayer is that calmer, saner heads will prevail, that the campaign takes more of a high road to talk about how we recover from COVID-19, how we recover from the economic shutdown, and begin to get back on our feet on these very troubling issues like race relations. My fear, though, is that's going to be a tough conversation to have given the political underpinnings of the current climate.
President Donald Trump's handling of the civil unrest unfolding in the United States has prompted widespread criticism, but Republican strategist Ford O'Connell believes the party's base will stick with the president. He says restoring law and order will be crucial in the Trump re-election bid.
I think it's going to be one of the nastiest. I also think it's going to be extremely close because of the way the Electoral College works. My home state of Florida is going to be extremely important. And I really think that you're going to see an election where, despite what the viewers in Australia see, we're just that divided as a country. And President Trump can win this, but it's going to come out where I think that this is the most critical moment of his presidency because he has to find a way to restore order, but also make sure we get justice for George Floyd. Here's the deal. A lot of the critics that are in his party, whether it's Michael Steele, who I know personally, or Ben Sasse, the senator from Nebraska, those were people who were critical of President Trump before he won election. You always see this in the American national media where they highlight the Republicans that are critical of the leadership, whereas in the Democratic Party, you never see that. But trust me, there's just as much consternation within both parties. Each party has their critics, but the very critics that are coming out against President Trump right now are the same critics who were out there before he won election.
The Bishop of St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington says she's outraged President Donald Trump used her church as a backdrop for a photo opportunity after police used tear gas to forcefully remove peaceful protesters near the White House.
He didn't come to church to pray. He didn't come to church to offer condolences to those who are grieving. He didn't come to commit to healing our nation, all the things that we would expect and long for from the highest leader in the land. The only time that President Trump has been at St. John's Church as president was on the morning of his inauguration. It did not serve the spiritual aspirations or the needed moral leadership that we need. It served as an instrument of his own forceful presence in the nation, and it did not address the grievous wounds that we are dealing with and the agony of our country. And so it was an abuse of the spiritual tools and symbols of our tradition and of our sacred space.
There have been violent scenes in Paris this morning. Thousands of protesters have lit flares and jumped on top of cars as fires burn along the streets. People are marching in solidarity with American demonstrators and in honour of a 24-year-old French man who died in police custody 4 years ago. Australia's embassy in Washington is speaking to the US State Department after a Channel 7 news crew was assaulted by police while reporting on the protests. It comes as the United States ambassador in Canberra insists his country takes the mistreatment of journalists seriously. Political reporter Noor Haydar joins us now from Parliament House. So Noor, what's the US ambassador had to say about this incident?
Yeah, the US ambassador says that his country is committed to protecting journalists. That follows some pretty shocking footage of an Australian television crew being assaulted by police while covering these protests in the United States. Amelia Brace and cameraman Tim Myers from Channel 7 were on the streets of Washington, D.C. yesterday reporting on these protests as police in riot gear stormed down the streets to clear protesters. They were then struck by by batons and shields as they tried to flee the scene, and they all were also rather struck by rubber bullets. Amelia Brace says those bullets have left bruises on her, and she has described feeling more in danger in the presence of police than protesters. The Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, has described this incident as a very serious matter. It's extraordinary to think that working journalists on the streets of the United States have been on the receiving end of this level of police aggression. The ambassador here in Canberra, Arthur Culverhouse, says that Americans and Australians both hold freedom of the press very dear. In a statement, he says that the United States takes the mistreatment of journalists very seriously, as do all who take democracy seriously. He says the United States remains steadfast in its commitment to protecting journalists and guaranteeing equal justice for all under the law. But we have seen other instances of this happening over the past week. This isn't the only occurrence of this level of sort of police aggression towards the working media. There have been instances where journalists and reporters have been tear-gassed and manhandled by police. So certainly not the only incident, but this one here has seen an Australian TV crew get involved in that.
So will Channel 7 pursue this matter further, Nor?
Well, a statement from Australia's ambassador in Washington, Arthur Sinodinos, says that he understands that Channel 7 will be making a formal complaint about this incident. The embassy is at the moment providing consular assistance to that television crew and and checking in on their welfare. The embassy is also in discussions with the US State Department, and they've offered assistance to help identify where this complaint should be directed. And the ambassador, Arthur Sinodinos, has also reiterated comments made by Foreign Minister Marise Payne overnight, saying that Australia supports peaceful protests.
And all we've heard from the Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong, also describing the scenes in the United States this week as dreadful. What else has she had to say?
Yeah, we've heard from Penny Wong this morning, but we've also heard from the former opposition leader, Bill Shorten. Now, Mr. Shorten says that America is no longer recognisable, and he believes many Australians would be very disturbed by Donald Trump's actions. You might recall before the federal election last year here in Australia, Bill Shorten described Donald Trump's views as barking mad. Today, he says the president has done very little to change his mind since then. The Shadow Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, wouldn't go that far. She was speaking on RN this morning, and she says that Scott Morrison and the Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, should be pushing the president to unite America, not divide its people.
I would hope that both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister would be making representations as a friend and an ally about the need for leaders to unite America.
On what basis? If you were Foreign Minister of Australia, what message would you be
That would be
sending?
my message, that it is the responsibility of leadership to ensure a stable democracy, that people are united.
That's the Shadow Foreign Minister there, Penny Wong, saying that Australian leaders, Prime Minister Scott Morrison and the Foreign Minister Marise Payne, should be making representations to the United States to encourage them to move away from this sort of tension and to unite people of America.
Thanks, Nor.